In October 1929, a trade magazine called the Macaroni Journal published a story that fooled the world for nearly 100 years. A Venetian sailor, it claimed, had watched a Chinese woman pulling long strands of dough through boiling water on the coast of China. He carried the idea to his captain. His captain carried it home to Italy. The story's inventors were so committed to the fiction that they gave the sailor a name. They called him Spaghetti. What the magazine left out, what nobody mentioned for decades, was that the whole episode had been manufactured by the National Macaroni Manufacturers Association to move more product off American grocery shelves. The myth worked so well, it ended up in a Hollywood film, in school textbooks, and in dinner table conversations for generations. But here is what the mythmakers could not have known. Pasta was already sitting in Italian pantries, listed in legal wills, and being shipped across the Mediterranean more than 140 years before Marco Polo ever came home. The most Italian food in the world was never invented in Italy. And the real story of where it actually came from is stranger than anything a trade magazine could dream up. Pasta today is a 17 million ton a year global industry. Italians alone eat an average of 23.3 kilograms per person per year. That is roughly the weight of a large car tire, consumed per person every 12 months. But the journey from a sealed earthenware bowl, buried under 3 meters of Chinese floodplain sediment, to the pot of water boiling in your kitchen right now, crosses 4,000 years, 3 continents, and at least 5 civilizations that most people never connect to the word spaghetti. This is that journey. The October 1929 issue of the Macaroni Journal described the scene in vivid detail. Marco Polo, the great Venetian explorer, was sailing home from China. One of his sailors went ashore on the Chinese coast and encountered a young woman pulling long, thin strands of dough through boiling water. The sailor was transfixed. He brought the idea to Polo. Polo brought it back to Venice. Italy discovered pasta. The world was fed. It was a beautiful story. It had a hero, an exotic discovery, a triumphant homecoming. It spread into classrooms, into cookbooks, and eventually into a 1938 Hollywood film where Gary Cooper sat in a Chinese home and tasted the dish for the first time. For nearly a century, millions of people believed it. Food historian Charles Perry traced the origin of that tale directly to the National Macaroni Manufacturers Association, a trade body whose sole purpose was selling more pasta to Americans. Perry found no evidence the story had any basis in historical fact. It was invented, whole cloth, as a marketing gimmick. The myth had already done its work. And the deeper irony is this: even a cursory look at the historical record destroys it immediately. A legal will drafted in Genoa in 1279, 16 years before Marco Polo returned from China in 1295, lists among a soldier's household possessions a basket of macaroni, valuable enough to be passed on to his heirs. Pasta was already a pantry staple in Italy before Marco Polo came home. The sailor named Spaghetti never existed, so if Marco Polo didn't bring pasta to Italy, where did it actually come from? The year is 2002. In the Qinghai province of northwestern China, a team of archaeologists is excavating a settlement called La Jia along the upper reaches of the Yellow River. The site is ancient, roughly 4,000 years old, and it was destroyed not by war or famine, but by a catastrophic earthquake and flood that struck with such sudden violence that it froze the entire community in place. Think of it as China's Pompeii. Bodies were found huddled in postures of protection. Pottery was scattered mid-use. Everyday life had been interrupted at the exact moment it was happening, then sealed under 3 meters of compacted floodplain sediment. The team was moving carefully through one section of the ruins when they found an overturned earthenware bowl, buried face down in the dirt. They brushed the soil away, steadied it, and turned it over. Inside, coiled and brittle and unmistakably intentional in shape, were pale yellow strands. They were thin, roughly 2 millimeters in diameter. They were long, some close to 50 centimeters, and they were approximately 4,000 years old. The discovery was extraordinary enough to stop the excavation. The bowl was carefully resealed to prevent contamination and transported to a laboratory in Beijing. The find was published in the journal Nature in October 2005. The paper identified the material as noodle-like remains from the late Neolithic Lajia site, the oldest noodle-like food ever documented in the archaeological record. Radiocarbon dating placed them at approximately 4,000 years old, belonging to a culture called the Chija people, who lived along terraced land above the river. Someone in what is now northwestern China was making long, thin strands of dough roughly 2,000 years before the founding of Rome. The discovery landed like a thunderclap in the food history world. Here, finally, was physical evidence, sealed, dated, scientifically verified. China had noodles first, case closed. Except it wasn't, not even close. Because the question everyone was now asking, does this prove China invented pasta and Italy learned from them, was actually the wrong question entirely. The paper published in Nature in 2005 did not just announce the find, it identified exactly what the Lajia noodles were made of. Using phytolith analysis and starch grain testing, researchers determined the material in that earthenware bowl. It was millet, specifically broomcorn millet and foxtail millet, grains that had been cultivated in northern China for at least 7,000 years. The Chija people had ground the millet into a fine powder, mixed it with water, and most likely stretched the dough by hand into those long, thin strands. It was skilled, intentional food making. But then, 6 years later, a different research team published a study in the journal Archaeometry that complicated the picture significantly. They argued that pure millet dough, without any added binding agent, does not have the structural properties needed to be stretched into long noodles. It breaks, it crumbles, it refuses to hold together under the tension required to form strands of any real length. The Lajia find, they suggested, may have been a different kind of noodle-adjacent food, perhaps pressed or cut rather than pulled, or the grain analysis may have missed additional ingredients. Hu Yuanlu, one of the researchers on the original Nature study, acknowledged directly in a later interview that the Lajia discovery did not by itself prove a direct ancestral link between ancient Chinese noodles and Italian pasta. That admission matters more than it might seem. It means that even the scientists who found and analyzed the world's oldest confirmed noodle-like food were careful not to draw the connection that the popular press immediately drew for them. The oldest noodles on Earth are real. The science behind them is legitimate, but still debated. And the question of whether they have anything to do with the pasta on your plate tonight turns out to hinge on a single grain, one that barely even grew in China. Here is the detail that changes the entire equation, and it comes down to a single word: durum. Chinese noodles, including the Lajia strands, and the hand-pulled noodles that would evolve across Chinese culinary history into the Lamian and Mian traditions, were made from millet and soft wheat, because those were the grains available in northern China. Soft wheat has relatively low gluten content. Dough made from it is tender and flexible when fresh, which makes it excellent for noodles you plan to eat immediately after cooking. But soft wheat dough becomes harder to dry reliably for long-term storage. It deteriorates in ways that durum dough does not, making it less suited to the durable dried pasta tradition that would eventually define Mediterranean commerce. The pasta that would eventually conquer the Mediterranean, the kind that could be shaped, dried on wooden racks in the sun, packed into barrels, loaded onto trading vessels, and boiled weeks or months later without falling apart, requires an entirely different grain. Durum wheat is harder, denser, and rich in gluten proteins that give dried dough its structure, its satisfying chew, and its ability to hold a geometric shape through vigorous boiling. Italian law, to this day, defines dry pasta sold on the domestic market as a product made exclusively from durum wheat semolina and water, with fresh and export categories following their own separate rules, but the core distinction remains real. So when the parallel emerges, a civilization in China making millet noodles at the same moment that cultures in the Arab world are beginning to work with durum wheat, these are not two versions of the same invention. They are two completely independent solutions to the same human problem. How do you make grain edible in a way that is satisfying, storable, and portable? Independent parallel invention is not rare in human history. Newton and Leibniz developed calculus simultaneously, working separately, on opposite sides of Europe. The point is not that one copied the other, The point is that when two different civilizations face the same challenge with different materials in different climates, they often arrive at solutions that look superficially similar but are built from different foundations. Chinese noodles and Italian pasta may share a general form. They are constructed from different grains, they solve different logistical problems, and the evidence connecting one directly to the other has never been found. Which raises the obvious next question. If pasta didn't come from China, who actually brought durum wheat pasta to Italy? Before we get to the real answer, there are two false trails worth clearing away, because they come up every time this question is asked. The first is ancient Rome. Roman sources do mention a food called lagane, or lagani, thin strips of dough. The Roman poet Horace mentions lagane in his satires, written around 35 BCE, describing a simple meal of leeks, chickpeas, and lagane, eaten after a long day on the road. Some food writers have pointed to this as evidence that pasta existed in ancient Italy, long before the Arabs arrived. But there is a critical distinction hiding in the detail. Roman lagane were not boiled in water and dried for storage. They were baked, fried, or cooked in broth and eaten fresh. Strips of fried dough are not pasta in any meaningful sense. They are a flat bread in a different shape. The Romans also had no durum wheat semolina pasta-making tradition of the kind that would later define Italian cuisine. The second false trail is the Etruscans. A relief carving from an Etruscan tomb dating to around the 4th century before the Common Era has been interpreted by some scholars as showing pasta-making tools. A rolling pin, a cutting board, something resembling a drying rack. But even if those tools were used in food preparation, they were almost certainly associated with testaroli, an ancient hybrid of flatbread and pasta that is still eaten in Tuscany and Liguria today. Testaroli is made by pouring batter onto a hot surface, cooking it into a disc, then cutting the disc into shapes that are briefly boiled. It is delicious. It is not dried pasta. Boccaccio's Decameron, written in the 1350s, does mention macaroni, evidence that pasta was clearly present in 14th century Italy. But Boccaccio was writing about food that already existed, not recording its invention. By his time, pasta had been in Italy for centuries. The question is how it got there. To find the actual origin of dried pasta, pasta as a technology, not just as a food, you have to follow the trade routes of the medieval Arab world. By the 9th century, Arab merchants and travelers had built one of the most sophisticated long-distance trade networks the ancient world had ever seen. Caravans moved between Baghdad and the port cities of the North African coast over routes that stretched for weeks without reliable water or shade. The heat was brutal. The distances were enormous. And the fundamental logistical problem was always the same. What can a traveler carry that will not rot, will not require cooking equipment to prepare, and will sustain a person under extreme physical conditions for weeks at a time? Fresh bread goes stale within days. Cooked grain ferments in the heat. Dried legumes take hours of fuel to cook and water you cannot spare. But thin strips of dough made from durum wheat, hard, dense, low in moisture, could be dried in the sun until they were completely rigid, packed into cloth bundles on the back of a camel, and kept without refrigeration for months. When a traveler stopped for the night, the strips went into a pot of boiling water and emerged as a hot, filling meal in under 10 minutes. It was not invented as cuisine, it was invented as engineering. The International Pasta Organization, drawing on scholarship that covers Arab culinary texts predating any Italian record of dried pasta, attributes the introduction of thin, dried pasta strands called itria to Arab culture, brought to Sicily in the 9th century. An early reference from what is now modern Iraq describes boiled dough strips resembling vermicelli, something any contemporary eater would recognize immediately. Pasta was not born in a kitchen. It was born in a desert, out of pure necessity, by people who needed to move fast and eat reliably across enormous distances. And the same geographical logic that made dried pasta indispensable in the desert made it commercially irresistible once it reached an island at the center of the Mediterranean Sea. Before we land in Sicily, it is worth pausing on the words, because the words tell the migration story more clearly than any map. The term itria, those thin dried strands of durum dough, traces back through linguistic history to an earlier Greek word, itria, which described flat dough cut into strips. Arabic absorbed the Greek term through centuries of trade and conquest, refined the recipe, transformed it into a preservation technology, and carried it westward across the Mediterranean world. At the same time, from the Persian side of the same trade network, came a different word entirely, laksha, a term meaning slippery, used to describe boiled noodles across a wide arc of the Middle East and Central Asia. That Persian word traveled in two directions at once. Eastward, it reached the islands of Southeast Asia, where descendants of it survive today in dishes called laksa. Westward, it moved into Eastern Europe, becoming lapsha in Russian and lokshina in Ukrainian. A single food technology, dried, boiled, grain-based strands, was spreading simultaneously in every direction, leaving its name embedded in every language it touched, the way a river deposits sediment along its entire length, not just at its mouth. The word macaroni itself traces through medieval Sicilian and southern Italian dialects, probably from the Greek makaria, a kind of barley broth. Another reminder that the vocabulary of pasta is not Italian in origin. It is a composite, assembled from Greek, Arabic, and Persian roots, the way the food itself was assembled from the agricultural knowledge of multiple civilizations. A map showing these word migrations across the Arab, Persian, and Mediterranean worlds traces the spread more vividly than any trade ledger. Itria, branching into lapsha, branching into laksa, a family tree written in vowel shifts and consonant borrowings across 5 centuries of commerce. The place where Arab pasta technology met European geography, and where the transformation from a desert survival food into a Mediterranean staple began, was Sicily. In the 9th century, Muslim forces from North Africa invaded and occupied the island, bringing with them durum wheat seeds, advanced irrigation systems that turned arid land productive, sugarcane, citrus trees, and their dried pasta. Sicily's climate turned out to be exceptional for pasta production. The island sits at the center of the Mediterranean Sea, surrounded by constant coastal breezes. The summers are long and fiercely hot. The combination of low humidity and moving air was ideal for drying pasta outdoors on wooden racks. The same low moisture, high heat conditions that Arab bakers had been using in North Africa, now available at an industrial scale on an island with direct shipping access to every corner of the Mediterranean. The earliest written record of pasta production anywhere in Western Europe comes not from an Italian chronicler or a Roman food writer, but from a Muslim geographer named Muhammad al-Idrisi. In 1154, working at the court of the Norman king Roger II, a Christian ruler who had inherited a largely Arab-administered Sicily and kept its scholars employed, al-Idrisi completed a massive geographical survey of the known world. In it, he described the town of Trebia, just outside Palermo, where large quantities of Itria were produced and shipped out to Calabria on the Italian mainland and to both Muslim and Christian territories across the sea. Pasta was already being manufactured at scale and exported internationally from Sicilian workshops before the 1200s even began. Commercial records from Genoa between 1157 and 1160 document significant imports of Sicilian pasta into the Italian mainland. Genoa, which would later build its own reputation as a pasta city, was in those early centuries primarily a buyer and distributor. The Arab presence in Sicily did not just introduce a food, it restructured the island's entire agricultural identity, and from Sicily, the technology moved north, east, and west, following the trade winds and the appetite of a growing medieval economy. For centuries after Sicily established the template, pasta remained largely a household product across the Italian peninsula, made by hand in individual kitchens, shaped by experience rather than equipment, varied by region and season, and whatever the local wheat harvest allowed. Rich households ate it as a side dish, alongside roasted meats. The poor ate it plain, with salt and a scraping of aged cheese, because it was filling and cheap, and required almost nothing else. The transformation came through Naples. Around 1800, the city began developing early machinery for pasta production, mechanical mixing systems, and improved drying equipment that allowed pasta to be made in quantities no household kitchen could match. Naples had geography working in its favor. The same coastal breezes that had made Sicily ideal for drying pasta also swept through the streets and cliffside districts of the Neapolitan waterfront, making open-air industrial drying practical at scale. By 1870, hydraulic presses and the first mechanical kneaders had arrived, replacing the human muscle that had always kneaded pasta dough. In 1889, a producer named Filippo De Cecco built a hot-air drying system at his factory in Fara San Martino, a small town in the Abruzzo region, allowing pasta to be dried in controlled conditions, regardless of weather. That innovation meant industrial pasta production was no longer dependent on climate at all. Italy then codified what it had spent centuries perfecting. Italian law defines dry pasta sold on the domestic market as a product made from durum wheat semolina and water. The EU went further. In October 2013, pasta di Gragnano, made in the town of Gragnano near Naples, received protected geographical indication status, specifying that authentic Gragnano pasta must be made from durum wheat semolina, water from the local aquifer, and must bear the characteristic roughness of bronze draw plates. A food that began as a desert survival technology had become, by the 19th century, an engineered product with legal definitions, protected designations, and a global export machine behind it. There is one final layer of the parallel invention reframe that deserves its moment, and it belongs here, before the final accounting, because it shows just how recently the dish we picture when we think of pasta actually solidified. When most people picture Italian pasta, they picture it with tomato sauce. But the tomato is not Italian. It is not even European. The first European written mention of the tomato was made in Italy in 1544, when a botanist named Pietro Andrea Mattioli recorded it, a fruit that had arrived from the Americas following Spanish colonial contact with the New World. For nearly a century and a half after that first mention, Europeans were deeply suspicious of the tomato. It was widely believed to be poisonous. It sat in botanical gardens as a curiosity, not in kitchens as an ingredient. Early European recipe collections combining pasta and tomatoes did not appear until the 18th and 19th centuries. A pairing that the whole world now considers the essence of Italian cooking is, at most, a few hundred years old. The dried noodle that arrived from Arab North Africa via Sicily met a fruit that arrived from South America via Spanish colonial trade routes, in a port city that happened to have both, and eventually someone put them on the same plate. There was no grand design. There was no moment of culinary genius. There was just the ordinary, accidental, endlessly surprising way that foods move around the world, following trade winds and migration routes, and colonial ships and immigrant memories, until they land somewhere and stay, and the next generation grows up believing that this is simply how it has always been. Today, Italy produces 4.2 million tons of pasta per year, out of a global total of 17 million tons. More than 60% of that national production is exported. Unione Italiana Food reported that in 2025, Italian pasta exports reached nearly 2.5 million tons, worth close to 4 billion euros. The average Italian still eats 23.3 kilograms of pasta per year, roughly the weight of a large dog, consumed per person, every 12 months. The chain from that earthenware bowl in the earthquake rubble of a Chinese river settlement, fragile yellow strands 4,000 years old, to the pot of water in your kitchen right now is not a single straight line, and it is not a story anyone designed. It passed through Arab desert logistics, Sicilian workshops under Norman kings, the wills of Genoese soldiers, the bronze dye factories of Naples, the immigrant trunks crossing the Atlantic, and the restaurant windows of Lower Manhattan and Buenos Aires and Melbourne. Millet noodles made for immediate eating. Durum wheat strands engineered to survive months in a desert. An island drying operation with Mediterranean export reach. A Neapolitan industrial revolution. A tomato that arrived from a continent nobody in Sicily had ever heard of, until someone put it in a pot and called it dinner. Pasta is not a single invention. It is a collaboration, 4,000 years long, assembled by dozens of civilizations, carried by merchants and migrants and colonizers and refugees across every ocean on the planet. And the most Italian thing about it, in the end, is exactly this. that Italians took all of that accumulated human ingenuity, from the Arab world to Sicily to Naples to the immigrant ships of the 19th century, and made it completely, unmistakably, beautifully their own. Subscribe to Tales of the Table, and every week we go looking for the epic story buried inside the ordinary thing on your plate. A trade magazine invented the Marco Polo pasta myth in 1929 to sell more noodles to American consumers. The oldest confirmed noodle-like food was found in China, 4,000 years old, and made from millet. But science confirms that Chinese noodles and Italian pasta are built from different grains, most likely independent inventions. The real origin of dried pasta lies with Arab traders who created itria, thin, dried durum wheat strands, as a desert survival technology, brought it to Sicily in the 9th century, and left behind a word that echoes across Arabic, Greek, Persian, Russian, and Indonesian to this day. The tomato that completes the dish arrived from the Americas in the 16th century. The food we call Italian is a 4,000-year collaboration built by dozens of cultures, and it is sitting in your kitchen right now. If the story of pasta, that it was never one culture's invention, that it crossed deserts and oceans and centuries before anyone called it Italian, made you see a familiar thing differently, then consider this. Every food on your table has a story like this one buried underneath it. The question is always the same. Who really made this, and why? Subscribe to Tales of the Table, and every week we will find the answer together.